Welcome everyone to our session of centering justice. And I hope hearing from the Detroit Youth Choir and Glory really grounds us today in how we're going to spend our time together. Um, and really knowing and uplifting that the youth and our today's time that we're going to talk about learning the world for ourselves. There is such power and wisdom and strength, and we're going to hear about ways in which we continue um, each other's and especially our youth's learning. So my name is Hamida Bhagarati. I am at NU as a program director, and I'm going to kick us off um, and to sort of do a little reference to Ananya, who, if you had sort of watched prior centering justice sessions, she would really name that everyone's coming from different places and spaces. And as you're moving into this space, yes, Ananya is here in the audience too. Hey, Ananya, we love you. Um, Also, sort of as we move in and shift, and this song was a beautiful way to ground us. Let's all take one collective deep breath. So we all arrive in this space together. So I'll share a little bit about centering justice, as that we started as a program at the very beginning of the pandemic. Um, that really asked folks and really sought to amplify the voices of the BIPOC community within our Southeast Michigan area, to uplift the significance and necessity of having communities of color be leaders in not only weathering the pandemic in light of capitalist and white supremacy movements, but also really uplifting our needs and asking us and others to dream about and help build a new, more inclusive future. So in the past and currently, we invite visionaries, storytellers, and healers that really are interrupting the status quo with the hope to have them inspire us to believe in and act in ways that create a more unjust, and thriving society. Um, so during our time together, Yodi will be in conversation with two of our today's speakers, and we'll hear invitations and demands from them in terms of what we can do to move action forward. And we have a new addition since we took a break, came back, um, and that we'll have a brief question and answer period at the end of the session with the audience. And we really are so grateful to have Dr. Tamara Tucker-Ibarisha with us, as well as Matthew Hamilton, to share how they create ways within themselves and their communities to learn for themselves in and outside of the classroom. So I will hand it over to Yodi to ground us some more.
Thanks, Tamita. Hey, everybody. I'm so geeked. Welcome back. It's a new season of Centering Justice. I feel like Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka got us all together this summer on the importance of caring for our minds and our bodies, right? I'm just back from a week of respite in Idlewild and just drawing upon much of what we learned over the last year to help shape me and to help guide me and to help ground me. And I'm grateful we had some rest in July, and I'm really excited for the year ahead. And that Ananya is here because, as many of you know, Ananya was my partner when centering justice was just a notion. When I said we have got to center the voices of folks of color, because I felt betrayed by our white brothers and sisters who had said out of their mouths they were committed to justice. And then like when those foundation Hunger Games began and those that pandering for money began, that a lot of those commitments to equity felt like they had gone away. And who knew that George Floyd would be murdered not 2 months later? And it really thrust this conversation into not just something that was important, but that was an imperative. So I just want to recognize Ananya. I'm so just so grateful. And then for her leadership and Y'all, Hamida is 1000% the truth, and we about to get it this season with Hamida and with Carly. And I'm just so delighted to welcome them into this beautiful and beloved community that we've curated really together. And I'm geeked that two of my favorite people in the world are here today to talk about learning the world for ourselves and ensuring that future generations are told their true stories. Today reminds me of a trip I took many moons ago. I was in high school, and Pat Manley, the counselor at Huron High School, Black woman, took a group of us on a tour of historically Black colleges and universities. My parents were divorced, and at the time my dad was living in DC. And so while I was visiting Howard and Spelman, I got a chance to see my dad. He was driving a cab at the time, and I remember telling him, "Daddy, I want to go to Spelman, or I want to go to Howard." And my dad, who is a first generation immigrant from Ethiopia, asked me, "Why? Why, Yodit? Why do you want to go to this Black college?" And for me, having been raised primarily as a Black girl in the city of Detroit, it was there on those campuses that I felt a deep sense of belonging. And I wanted to attend a college where my history and my identity would be affirmed, not erased. And I didn't end up going. I went to EMU. I'm a proud Eagle. But I never forgot that statement. In fact, it rolled around in my head a lot, why my daddy didn't think I needed to go to an HBCU. And it wasn't until much later when I visited his home country, our home country of Ethiopia, that I got some clarity, healing really. When I got back and people asked me, well, how was the trip? The best way I could summarize it was that our story does not begin with pain. That's what I think my daddy wanted me to know that day, was that while it was important for me to understand my Blackness, that Black in America is not Black all over the world, and that we are the global majority, we Black and brown bodied people. So when we started thinking about the way that white supremacists are challenging critical race theory and challenging our nation's racist history, we didn't want to go there. We feel like there are enough platforms that are talking about CRT. We wanted to go to the people we know and love and trust that are helping to heal, to repair, to retell, and to remake and reclaim really our history and the stories that must and will shape all of our children's lives. And importantly, Tamara and Matt, who you'll hear from today, honey, they got receipts for how they are helping the children of this community understand who they are and whose they are. So help me, if you will, in welcoming them and thanking the two of them for saying yes. Carly, you want to bring them into space?
Yeah, absolutely. So glad to be here with you all this afternoon. So to get things started, we always just want our speakers to bring their whole selves into this space. And so kind of in that spirit, Tamara and Matt, we'd like to ask each of you to tell us about the communities and identities that you are drawing upon as you enter this conversation.
All right, I guess I'll jump in there first and just say hello to everybody. I'm really excited to be here and have an opportunity to talk with you. I wear a lot of hats, so that means a lot of identities. I come into this space as a Black woman who is a wife and a mother, and I'd like to think of myself as a community mother. I am an artist, I'm a dancer, and that has informed, as we sort of prepared for this, informed a lot of how I think about education and learning. I am an educator myself. I am a college professor at Eastern Michigan University. That's why I was given the what's up when you mentioned EMU. And I teach biology, and being a member of the scientific community, I think also really informs how I think about learning and education. And so I guess I would say that if I had to classify myself professionally, I would say I'm an educator, but that learning and that education really happens in a reciprocal way, where I am both student and teacher in many spaces. And it happens inside of formal institutions like EMU, but also in very informal institutions in terms of in my community, within my family, and within Washtenaw County. And just adding that I'm also a co-founder of Black Men Read with my buddy Yodit there. And so that's yet another space where I think I'm thinking a lot about storytelling, which we've talked about a lot and we'll talk about today, and education. So those are the identities and experiences that I'm bringing to this conversation.
And I'm Matt. I'm so thrilled to be here. This is really exciting for me to be in this space, and it's actually really affirming for me in a lot of ways to have been invited and to be able to share space with you all. I use he and they pronouns. I am queer, I am mixed race, which is part of why this feels really affirming for me, because that's been a journey. And when I think about this idea of learning for ourselves, for me, my journey around my mixed race identity, which is a mixture of whiteness and this, ambiguous, often erased mixture of Latino, Hispanic, Chicano, Mexican American, this variety of names that we have for what I know and what I don't know about my maternal family, which comes from the border area and the relatively new border area in the southwestern part of this land. And the two lands that have been constructed on top of indigenous lands. And so I think really critically about like how I've learned about that identity and how it shows up for me. And my family and my partner shares that identity as a second generation Mexican American, Chicana, amazing person, and how we share that with our kids. So I'll probably speak more about that later, but the other things I'm bringing into the space, I also connect with Tamara, with Dr. Tucker-Ibarisha in a lot of ways, because I consider myself an educator too. I do teach in public education, I teach middle school, I teach high school, I also teach at EMU, and I graduated from EMU too, so I'm another Eagle. I teach future teachers, I work with young people in the classroom and in organizing spaces, sort of affinity group, like social spaces, as well as like organizing and agency spaces where young people are stepping into their power to demand what they deserve in our schools and in our communities. And I love that part of my work. I'm a parent, I'm a partner. I'm young, and I'm sort of bridging the not maybe being young anymore, but I like to bring that into this space because it's so important to me to recognize that, especially in this space where Yodit, brought me in, and there's so many people here that I have learned from that I consider my mentors and my elders, and that intergenerational learning is such a huge part of what's important to me and what I want us to sit with as we think about this question and the visioning that we're going to do today. So thank you all.
Dr. Tucker-Ibarisha and Matt, thank you so much for being here with us today. I know that the tagline for this event drew folks today. So I just want to return us back to our big question of how do we continue to ensure that future generations are told their true histories? We are called to claim our power and push against erasure as historical racial equities are included or excluded in educational curriculums. And we're going to have a conversation that centers ways to keep our stories alive in the face of polite white supremacy and capitalism. So I will return it to Yodi to start off our conversation.
You got that right. We will not be erased. Tamara, I want to hear you and then Matt just like talk about the stories that helped to shape your journey into learning, into education. What made you fall in love with learning and teaching?
I think that it really takes me back to elementary school, and this story kind of has multiple parts because I think about this ideology from the perspective of someone who's a scientist, and I think about my first grade teacher who was a amateur archaeologist. He was a children's author. He was a white man who taught in this first grade classroom. And the thing that really stuck out the most was that he was so enthusiastic and really warm and welcoming. And that's the thing that I think really stuck with me and started to draw me into science. But, you know, being a first grader, I would also say those are some of those early experiences that drew me into learning. And then the other piece of this thing, I think, would just be really thinking about my family experience. I was raised by my mother, who was a single mother, but who was an educated woman who was pursuing education. During most of my growing up, we moved from Chicago, where I was born, to East Lansing, Michigan, and my mom was a graduate student at Michigan State University. And that experience really percolated my upbringing because my mom was in this PhD program from the time I was in second grade and really finished, I want to say she finished right around the time that I graduated high school. And so, you know, her journey was a unique one as well, being a single parent, raising two children, maintaining a household independently, and then also, you know, going through this graduate study. And so I think in many ways, my embrace of education was really encouraged by my family and encouraged by my mom's example and the opportunities that I had to encounter teachers who made learning exciting, fun, and an open opportunity for me. I can really clearly track my love affair with science to having teachers who gave me the opportunity to explore with science, not just memorize facts. And I think that really made a huge difference in terms of me seeing a place for myself in that learning and in that particular field and ultimately as a career too. So I think that my experience as a student and as a learner really informed the way that I like to try and show up in the classroom as an educator and really think a lot about accessibility. And I think that the segue between that and sort of this conversation we have around equity is that, you know, when we come into classroom spaces, believing in our students, believing that actually every student that walks into the classroom has something meaningful to contribute, something that they can learn, some way that they can grow. You know, you have to sort of do a bunch of mental gymnastics to decide you're going to exclude certain people out of that because of their particular cultural, religious, ethnic, whatever identities you decide. And I think that you know, the people who are true educators, true teachers understand that every single human comes into that classroom with the potential to really do something phenomenal as a learner. And so that's the sensibility that I set up my classes and set up my classroom with, you know, seeing that the classroom really can be a space where everyone can be seen, everyone can be heard, and everyone can gain something from it, as long as we show up into that space openly and authentically. And as the people who run those spaces, we genuinely have to believe in the potential of those students that step into the classrooms, you know, to be able to grow and thrive there and do everything we can to make it a space for that. So I feel like that's my sort of trajectory in teaching and learning.
Matt, I'm curious for you too. And, when we were planning for this call, there was an offering that you gave us about your own healing that I think is really important and potent for this conversation. If you wouldn't mind offering that too.
Yeah. Um, I mean, first, I totally agree and connect with what was just shared around like what I think I would call, and I try to practice, like relentless wonder, which is just this energetic, like undying commitment to always being impressed, always being surprised, always um, always being encouraged and energized by the young people that we work with and by what they bring to us. And there's so much out there in education that's negative and enables us to put up walls as educators. And when I think about stepping into my classroom as first a learner and a human and someone who's collaborating with young people in a space, that is held by all of us. That's really a community, authentically a community, and this opportunity to learn. I think, learning for me has always been something that's exciting. I've always been curious. I feel really grateful and privileged that I was able to pursue learning in a variety of different ways and spaces. And in a lot of ways, it's created this sort of all over the place. Like I have a lot of interests and a lot of sort of sparse knowledge and connections and the ways that I learn, but that serves me in the classroom because I know that I have learned in academic spaces. I have learned through reading, I've learned through cooking, I've learned through relationships, and being able to constantly remind myself about the ways that learning is constantly happening. And that includes, for me, learning about how I can better facilitate learning. So every time I go into a space, whether it's an educational space or not, I'm observing how that learning is happening. And then I've been able to be creative about how to bring that work into my educational space and share that with young people. When I facilitate with adults, that influences how I work with young people, or when I, interact with people in a coffee shop, that impacts how I seek to set up my educational space. And so that impacts me a lot. But yeah, I had sort of a different experience. I'm not one of those teachers that can trace my connection to education back to teachers or schooling. I had a positive experience in school, but not overwhelmingly so. I just sort of did the thing and made it through. And much of the learning that was impactful for me was happening outside of school because I, sought it out, because I was participating in other kinds of activities and cultural spaces. And I think the healing that has been able to happen, that continues to happen for me. I remember specifically when I was young and I was really interested in my identity that I wasn't learning about from my family and I wasn't learning about from school. And I remember literally Googling Mexican novels and stuff and going to the library and picking that out and reading Bless Me Ultima, which is this really famous, Rudolfo Anaya is the author, Mexican-American novel. It was formative and interesting for me in terms of that, but that being able to seek, my own learning and continually doing that with transparency with the young people that I work with and alongside the young people that I work with and learning together and seeking out those stories. And a little bit like being a punk. I kind of identify as a punk in a lot of ways because there are a lot of times when I'm just this isn't working and we need to find other ways to learn. And again, that relentless wonder, right? So there's part of it that's always being impressed by the young people we work with, but also always asking questions, which that's what science is all about, right? And so like the interdisciplinary nature of how learning is just always happening constantly for those of us who have the courage to be curious and imaginative. So it's continuous for me. I think I need to constantly be reminded of why I love learning and why I love educating and participating in spaces like this, right? So
Yeah. Tamara, I'm curious about if you could talk a little bit about the teaching side. You know, you talked about the classroom. I've witnessed you as a community mama teaching. Most notably, I'll uplift the experience of bringing my son, you know, who is very important to me, that even though, you know, technically he's only a quarter African, it's important for me as I think about how to save him from systems of white supremacy that would try to, you know, box him into these really narrow definitions of Black masculinity. I really try to put him in spaces where he's affirmed. And your living room for Kwanzaa is one of those places. Tell me the story of this German colleague that you worked with. Tell me a little bit more about that you shared in our planning session.
Sure. So I think one of the things in our planning session that we touched on, and I think this is important, is sort of this idea of identity. And I think this relates to the idea of the story of who we are. And so I'll lead up to the conversation with the German colleague and say that, you know, my family, and I would really give my grandmother credit for this, was someone who was always naturally curious about what she called Black history, right? Okay, so the history of Black people in the world and education and learning. And so as a kid, you know, I came up in a predominantly white school district. I went to East Lansing Public Schools. And in my grandmother's footsteps, my mom was another one of those parents that really kind of took ownership of making sure that I knew a bit about my history and felt a sense of belonging in that particular story of our history, and also felt that there was a place for me in the public school system, and if she didn't see it naturally occur there, made space. So all that to say that, you know, in elementary school, I was usually one of 2 Black girls in my grade for most of elementary school. And my mom was one of those moms who would call the teacher and show up at Black History Month with a suitcase or a bag of artifacts. We had lots of African artifacts in our home, and she would teach, you know, and that conversation changed through the years as she showed up. I remember in the very beginning, you know, it was really basic, and it really began with the idea that, you know, Black people in this country experienced the slave experience, but that our ancestors came from Africa. And that was sort of the important nugget, that we had a beginning to our story that wasn't necessarily slavery, but something that came before, and shared a lot of those things. And this went on through middle school, where she talked a little bit more about things like stereotypes, things like the legacy of minstrel shows in the United States. You know, she really delved into some of those tough topics. And I think I took a lot of things away from that. But one of them was that, you know, she was going to interject what she didn't see in the school system into the school system for the sake of her child, I should say children, because she did that for both me and my sister. And so I think that really primed me to be a person who could see that education isn't just what happens in the classroom, but also what kind of happens in the communities. So fast forward, I get to college and I start participating in this mentoring program, where us as young college students are working with elementary school students in what I like to call the community school, culture school model. And that really shaped the beginning of what became our Kwanzaa celebrations when my husband and I married eventually later and moved to Ypsilanti. But it was really just this idea that, you know, we as communities have to be responsible for teaching our children their history, teaching them not really just their history, but really what we were doing was giving those children a story of who they were and what their narrative was. So looking at where we've been, looking at where we are and giving them a sense of where we could go. And I think that was always the important piece, and the place where it segues with education, because I think that education that I got from my mom and the education that we were focused on when I was a mentor in these programs was really all about empowering our kids to be able to go into the spaces of the world, be it the public schools or the universities or wherever, and have this really strong sense of self, this really strong sense of worth in terms of believing that we are capable and worthy to be able to enter whatever institution we choose and be successful and thrive in those spaces. And so after college, that really kind of segued into my husband and I spending lots of time thinking about, what does that look like when it's really just a part of the fabric of a community. And so these Kwanzaa celebrations we have, we're really sort of in some ways the culmination of what that looks like. And I just think of it as a sort of a cultural community school model where, we began about maybe 10 years ago now with some friends of ours, other couples that we knew. And this was even probably before we had kids, so longer than 10 years ago. And we had this annual Kwanzaa celebration that has grown over the years and continued, even to some degree through COVID. We did it virtually with other organizations in the years during the pandemic. But it has been a real moment for community gathering, but a moment and an opportunity for us to, I almost don't want to use the word teach, I almost want to say imprint upon our children and upon ourselves this story, this narrative of who we are as a community of people who I would say we, primarily identify as African American. So to pick up this story of the German colleague, I was in the biology department and I'm a part of a Congolese dance company. I've traveled to Africa. I wear African clothes when I come to teach at school. It is very much a part of my identity, and it's a very intentional part of how I show up and how I identify myself, even to the degree that, we have an African hyphenated last name with the Ibarisha. And this German colleague was asking me questions about it. And, I can appreciate that because a lot of time Europeans don't come to the conversation of race with the same kinds of sensibilities that white Americans and American people in general do. They often are a lot more frank. And it basically was sort of making this comment of like, it seems so strange to me that, Black people in this country identify as African Americans. They don't really talk about any particular country, I mean, even he was sort of connecting it to the idea of people who are German Americans and how they really don't necessarily connect with German culture beyond maybe, I think he said like lederhosen and sausages, he's just like how there's this kind of this very like superficial surface level connection with the culture. And I interjected, and said, yeah, I'm sure that seems strange to you, but you have to remember for most African Americans, and again, this is sort of pre-23andMe conversation, we don't have the privilege or the opportunity to actually know directly where our families came from or to be connected in the same way that someone who is German American or Italian American gets to still be connected to that cultural legacy because of the transatlantic slave trade that was taken away. And again, this is not a universal statement, but for many African Americans whose families endured the slave trade, we don't know what countries our families come from. We don't know what languages they speak. We don't know, what those particular cultural traditions are. And I realized that what my grandmother and my mother and all of those experiences really laid the foundation for was me taking on the idea that it could be looked at as a deficit, but instead they presented it as an opportunity for us to really construct who it is that we get to be, and it brought me to a talk that was given by Dr. Naim Akbar called Excellence in Evolution, where he talked about African Americans as this new vanguard of Africans. So in my husband and I's way, it's like versus us being locked to a particular community or a particular tradition, we really have this privilege to be able to embrace all of that. We sort of jokingly identify ourselves as like every African, right? And I can do Congolese dance, and I have one daughter that has a West African name, and I have one daughter that has an East African name, and we have this Yoruba last name, and it really presents this opportunity for us to embrace the richness of the variety of African cultures and traditions and customs and foods and all of the above, and bring that into this identity that we've crafted as a family, and really with the Kwanzaa celebration as a community. And I think we feel like that's just so very important, because to me, that is what undergirded my ability to operate in spaces that were sometimes open and sometimes not open to me as a Black woman in the sciences. And I really see that as key for every child, not just Black children, but every child, to be able to operate in a society from a position of power, from a position of identity, and understanding what your story is, and really the sense that, you know, we always get the opportunity to create that story about ourselves. I can remember in college some classmates sort of challenging that idea, and they're like, well, you never been to Africa, how do you decide you're African? And at a certain point, the affirmation was, because I say I am, right? It's the idea of self-determination, that we get to decide who we get to be. You know, and I think that's such a powerful thing.
Wait a minute, stop right there. That was a word, a whole ass word. Stay there for a minute.
Yeah. And we can tie it right to Kwanzaa. I mean, the second principle of Kwanzaa, which is many of our favorite, is kujichagulia, self-determination. Like, we get to decide who we get to be. And again, like, you know, we're in these countries and these societies where they decided we were Black, they decided we were this. So why can't we now take that same power of ability to, you know, that same ability to craft a story about ourselves and make it one that's going to be really empowering and uplifting for us. And so that's what we've done with the Kwanzaa celebrations and many of the other things that we're involved in the work that we do. And it really has added just such a richness, I think, to our family life and to our lives personally. So you know, that's kind of that they gave my German colleagues some perspective. But I didn't quite tell them all that. But
that would be you checked him. That was a hard check. Come on, Hamida.
Hey,
come on,
you know, yeah, you just put it into context. Really putting it into context. So.
You know, I'm still processing, you know, Tamara, all of the different ways that your mom and your grandmother is a blessing to the community, especially in the way that you were uplifted and raised to learn about your peoples and histories and co-create that learning, right? And, you know, Matt, your Be a Punk really resonates with me. But also what's coming up for me is that both of you are in the academy, right? So you are formal educators, and you have been brought up and have worked within those dominant narratives of education. And you also are, and your families have been punks, right? You push back against that. So I would love if you could share with us sort of like how you sort of pivoted from that sort of what the academy, the ivory towers are, how you pivoted and how you balance the two.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting, and I think Dr. Tucker-Ibarisha has already shared a little bit about like what a really strong partnership can do for this. And so I think really critically about my partner, my wife, is an early childhood educator and is an organizer and has her own incredible story that has been so impactful to me. And a lot of the perspective that she brings into our family is around the lessons and the wisdom that much younger people can hold, and the value of play and the value of fun and imagination and artistry. And you know, I already spoke about like my own kind of curiosity and imagination, and so those things show up in our home. You know, that's something that's cultivated, and taking the time to, again, just like sort of relentlessly be in awe of young people and what they bring to us when they ask questions and when they have curiosities and when they engage in play and learning those lessons. So it takes energy, because I think what I'm describing is like resisting the burnout that can happen and finding those spaces for joy and finding those spaces where those lessons feel authentic and that community feels authentic, because I've been in spaces as an educator where it's exhausting to show up as yourself and embrace these things that we're talking about, and also have to sort of pander and to fit and work within that dominant narrative. The other thing that's really interesting to me is that actually a lot of pieces of the dominant narrative show up and encourage those of us in education to like try new things that are actually really, really old things. They're actually ancient indigenous things that we're stealing and renaming. And we're not acknowledging that. And so a lot of the times I've been sort of on a pathway and in thinking about, you know, how we engage young people or how we like rebrand classrooms and offer flexible choice, or we offer like, you know, we bring in a guest speaker, or we like are gonna use a restorative circle in order to promote community or culture, right? These things which have actually been around and have been pushed out of educational spaces, which traditionally are meant to be community spaces, right? We're supposed to be learning intergenerationally. We're supposed to be learning with each other in circles, in experiential ways, in hands-on ways. And as I say these things, right, like those of us in education are like, oh, that's what like we're supposed to be doing, and it's new and it's pushing back on tradition. And it's very interesting to me the ways that like education constantly wants to kind of rebrand itself, but within that, it's accepting the status quo, and it's like not pushing enough because it's still within these boundaries. And I think if we can really challenge and really call on ourselves to recognize when those things show up and like follow the pattern and find, you know, I said this, I was looking back through the notes from our conversation the other night, like everything, there's always a Black woman on the other side, right? There's always an elder of color on the other side of these new things that we're trying to figure out the best way. And if we could cut that out and actually go back to what works for the young people of the global majority, the young people that are not being served in schools, that are not being taken care of, and frankly are at risk, like their livelihoods and their very lives are at risk because of the systems that we have, you know, that's what we owe them.
Man, that hits home, Matt, a few things. So one of the things that I've loved about watching you navigate your own healing journey is the ways you've gone to indigenous practices of cooking, of you know, community care, your work around Ipsy Pride, you know. We can't fix ourselves, right? We really need each other to heal from the harm and the effect of white supremacy. And we keep using the master's tools, right, to try. But the other thing that's so affirming about what you said for me that I think is a tool of liberation for those who are educators, regardless of where that education is happening, is a reminder that we have this ancestral and indigenous wisdom in us already. And it makes me think about early in the pandemic, or last fall rather, about this time, we had a conversation with a researcher and educator at U of M, Macy, and she reminded us of the Freedmen's Bureau. This was a group of mostly folks of color who really were the architects of public education as we know it. But as they were organizing, right, and forming, there were white supremacists who were threatened by an educated Black population, by an educated, working class population, right, who intentionally, and we see it with the Daughters of the Confederacy, and you better know that this crap around CRT is the roots of that, right? Where there is a systematic change of the narrative in the story, because you can control a people when you can control their story, right? It is by design that our children are only learning certain things. And it's not just to support white supremacy, but to support capitalism, right? We are educating folk to create worker bees that will produce. And so thank you for reminding us of, thank you, Pam, reminding us that we can actually, you know, something that's grounded me over the last year and made me check my own ageism is that in the whole of history, it's not just been Black and brown people who have got us free. It's been young Black and brown folk that have got us free. So I want to spend some of our final minutes before we go into some Q&A with you all talking about the vision, right? What we're in is the vision that those colonizers and white supremacists created. That it is the same, I mean, and this is macro and micro. The disparate outcomes we see for boys and children of color and now girls and differently able folk and queer folk, this is the manifestation of the vision of the 20th century, of the 19th century. But now I think what I saw, especially in Tamara, you know, this is another way in which you inspired me. You know, last year, folks were like, especially Black folks in my circle were like, public schools aren't working for me. I'm pulling my kid out. Like, you know, this whole idea that equity meant that every kid had to go back in the classroom, we challenged. But tell me, what are you thinking about, right? So that's the current vision, right? It's happened. We've seen it play out. We continue to see it play out. I think, Matt, your point is, and we keep trying to like tinker in this broken system and reintroduce these things as innovative when we haven't really gotten at the root, which is that is the vision playing out. But I want to hear, you know, what are you thinking about for how we're going to collectively re-envision or return to, reclaim, as you said, Matt, the vision of our ancestors, our human ancestors, before settler colonialism, before white supremacy, before capitalism. You know, how are we going to ensure our babies are learning and thriving and flourishing? What is the new vision? Matt, I'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's this really interesting like juxtaposition, right? Between, we have this system that it's another one of those systems that we talk about and we say it's not working, and it's actually, as you described, working as intended, you know. And the preschool to prison pipeline is not an accident, right? The ways that our curriculum is not serving the global majority is not an accident, right? The ways that the dominant culture shows up in these spaces. And at the same time, and maybe, you know, part of this is certainly because I'm a part of it. You know, I will acknowledge maybe some of this is because of the limits of my own vision. But at the same time, I want to offer that this institution is also the way that we are reaching the most young people in our communities, like physically, right? And that's a surface level statement because we're not reaching them, we're not meeting them where they need to be, we're not serving them appropriately, we're not responding to, you know, there's all kinds of issues. And we have, you know, 5 days a week, these buildings are full of the young people in our communities. And so the challenge that I want to issue and the vision that I hold as possible as sort of this step, you know, maybe there's an even further vision that looks even more beautiful and gets us even closer. But right now with these buildings that we have, where we have young people, I envision, you know, these spaces where they're community driven, they're community centers, they're these containers for all of the young people in our community to learn in the ways that are meaningful, are important. You know, I love this idea of like imprinting the culture that was offered, and also this like being open to what they hold, you know, and the intergenerational wisdom that can be shared with them, but that we can learn from them. And the ways that, as I think we've talked about a little bit, like culture is not stagnant, you know, identity is not stagnant. And the thing that young people have is this willingness to show up as who they are, you know, until we take that away from them. And so if we can create spaces where they continue to do that, and they can show up in their identities, in their interests, in their skills, in their passions, and create and reimagine what culture can look like, you know, what it means to be a Black kid in America, what it means to be a Latino kid in America, what it means to be an Indigenous kid. My ultimate vision that I love to talk about, that's like wild and out there, but is so exciting for me, is like, you know, when co-workings first sort of started becoming a thing, and there were these community spaces where like professionals could go and work and just be in a space together, I was like, what if schools looked like that? Like for young people to just sort of pursue their work, to do their jobs in spaces together, but also alongside other members of the community. Like, what if these giant buildings that we put so much money and resources and time into, and we have so many bodies every day, right? What if these were the literal hubs of our communities, where everybody who is working on something in our community could show up and just be together and be in that spirit of learning and connection and creation. And we've got young people learning from mentors, and adults learning from young people, and ideas happening, and all this beautiful stuff that we're then taking the direction of the young people. The learning's going to happen. You know, if you've ever spent time in a space with young people, you know that the learning happens, and then the standards come second. And I'm not worried about any of that. But that's my vision. That feels incredible to me.
It is incredible, Matt and Tamara. We I think I want you to talk a little bit about how we're experimenting with that outside of the school edifice, while we figure out how to manifest or badgefest or womanifest Matt's vision. Talk a little bit about Wakanda and Washtenaw.
Yes. So, you know, I would just say that I really love, Matt, your vision of what you talked about, and I was actually really inspired to hear you talk about it in our planning meeting too. And I think you're 100% locked into a really creative way to actually make these public spaces do what they want to do for us. And I think my contribution to that thought was really like a both and I'll speak slightly about the both, and then we'll jump into the and with Wakanda and Washtenaw. One of the things that we really shifted kind of early on with our work with Black Men Read, which is this literacy initiative we have in Washtenaw County, was realizing that if we wanted to reach everyone, if we wanted to reach the children that potentially have the biggest deficits in literacy, or who could really benefit the most from our work, being in schools was going to be really important. And Matt, you laid it right out. That's where everybody is. So in some way, if we want to reach everyone outside of our silos, be they socioeconomic or, you know, just the people you happen to know, being in those public spaces where we know all children are is the way that we can most effectively do that. And so a big part of our strategy with Black Men Read has really been working on ways to partner with schools in really meaningful and effective ways in terms of PD with teachers. And our ultimate vision really was to have readers in residence who are Black men that are placed in these communities in much the way the model that Matt kind of talked about. So they're there in the schools, not only just to read to the children, but to establish relationships and to contribute to the spaces in the ways that we know they can. And so that's the both piece of it. And I think the thing that I I hold on to, of course, to is the and part. And that really comes back to this idea of, not ceding education only to these traditional institutions, but understanding that really most of the learning that takes place is going to be outside of the classroom. And so that if we really feel strongly about our young people being educated, knowledgeable, and grounded, that has to be happening in the community spaces. And so Yodi and myself and a number of these people who are part of this kind of Kwanzaa celebration that has basically organically developed, got together and formed a group that we called Wakanda and Washtenaw. And this was about 3 years ago. And while the name is really catchy, it really came from a conversation about just why people were so enamored with the movie Black Panther, and really capturing the idea that, Wakanda, of course, is an imaginary place, but it's our imagination of what could be, of what is possible. And so we captured that idea of Wakanda because we felt like it was important to think about, if we were going to, instead of focusing on what the public schools are not doing or what these organizations may not ever be interested in being for us as communities and our children, if we were to create this ideal world, this ideal situation, we create our Wakanda right here in Washington, what would it be? What would it look like? And these conversations and these meetups really began around that. Like, what do we feel are the things that our kids can benefit from, that our children would enjoy, the things that will elevate their ability to not just survive, but also thrive in this crazy world. And that was what Wakanda and Washtenaw was. And that's really just the latest iteration of this work that we've always been doing, right? Where we're constantly finding ways to reach our children and to meet them where they need to be, whether that's through something physical like dance or martial arts, whether it's through something like science outreach activities, or whether it's something like just simply being together and talking about history and talking about culture, and the ways that sort of segues and undergirds our ability to thrive and survive in society. So I think that's that both and, where, I think it is absolutely important that we're thinking about how to reimagine school spaces. We're pushing against things that are systematically set up to keep us out and to keep our voices out in those school spaces, but then really taking that ownership to say, and in the meantime, we're just going to create what we
That's
need.
right.
When
That's
y'all
it.
get yourselves together, that will
That's
be
it.
great. In the
That's it.
meantime,
Yeah,
we'll
we're
just do
not
it
waiting on
for
nobody to
our
save
kids,
our
right?
babies, right?
Because,
We're not
yeah, and
going. Yeah, we're
right.
not. We're over that. We're not
and
waiting. And I think it's important to say that Wakanda and Washtenaw built upon the legacy of folks like Helen Oliver and others
yeah,
in Ann Arbor Public Schools,
right.
who had created in the 80s and 90s a Saturday school for Black kids, because the disparate outcomes that we see are not new. In fact, we've seen them ever since the Brown versus Board of Education decision, where it is presumed that white schools are going to serve our children better, and we begin a systematic divestment in Black and brown communities and schools, right? So we were building upon, but what I think the difference is that, and the invitation here is that we were not, the Saturday school of past really relied on school funding and school support. Right. And frankly, somebody got pissed that it was a Saturday school for Black kids, complained, threatened to sue the district, and away goes that program. But we see all over this community now, language schools and religious schools and other ways that cultures are educating their populace, their communities, that is important while we figure out. And that's really what we're calling folks in this Zoom and in Centering Justice and in this community to, is how are we going to ensure that all of our children have an opportunity to thrive? And how might we challenge what we know to be quote unquote public education to deliver on its promise, right? Its vision, which is owned by all of us. This isn't just putting the onus on educators. It's also about the community meeting schools in that chasm and in that gap. And that's what we did with Black Men Read. When there are no Black men at Mitchell Elementary School for my son to see, to inspire who he can be, I'm not complaining. We're gonna get some brothers to come in there and read some books until Ann Arbor figures out how to, you know what I mean? I'm not waiting. We can't wait. And that's really the invitation. Wow, this is, I could talk to y'all for 17 more hours. Let's transition though, because I want folks, actually Darnisha kind of teed it up. I think they want to know how we get adjudicated young folk into Wakanda and Washtenaw. Hamida, can I kind of bounce back to you and maybe we can open this up for some questions? I mean, I have a quick answer to that, which is we shouldn't be locking kids up in prison to begin with. Let's hold Ellie Savage's feet to the fire that we will no longer have children in a juvenile injustice system ever again. Again, that's on our watch. Let's ensure that somebody like Brian Mackey, who had a particular agenda around locking kids up, that can never happen again, y'all. But I'd be curious to hear what our speakers have to say. But I think we need to abolish punishment systems for kids.
Yodi, I'm there with you and I feel that. I also I wanted to check in with our speakers to see if they had any additional demands or invitations to kind of issue out to our community right now before we shift it over to questions.
I think I want to just put an invitation, and this really does come right out of the space of the Wakanda and Washtenaw, and that lesson that I think Yodi tied in, that, you know, it's really important that we are paying attention to what systems are doing, paying attention to policy. But I think it's often so easy to get completely caught up in those discussions and those fights that we cede the power that we have to just literally get together and make change and do things, you know, and I think that it really is important that everyone who feels like they have a particular issue or a problem, you know, like I guess I should say, I'm seeing people get so caught up really in this discussion about what's going to be in the curriculum, what's going to be allowed, what's not going to be allowed. And I think that we as people forget that, you know, children come out of our homes, out of our communities, and we always have the opportunity to be able to teach and inform them and educate them into the ways of thinking about and viewing the world that we want them to see. And I guess I just want us to not ever cede that power to be able to do that. I think that it's really important that not just Black and Brown communities, but all communities are actively continuing to do that. You know, if you're finding that the districts and the systems around are not portraying and purveying the messages that you know to be important, you know, grab your kids, grab your neighbors' kids, grab your friends' kids, and have those conversations, right? And they don't have to be anything really structured or formal. I mean, a lot of that Wakanda and Washtenaw work and this Kwanzaa work is around celebration, right? It's around hanging out and getting together, but having these conversations in a way where our children are having them together with their peers, and it's affirming those ideas. So it's not just mom and dad, it's not just grandma or elders saying these ideas, but it's these ideas being discussed and affirmed amongst their peers, and really just solidified in that way. So I'll just say that, you know, I really, my invitation would be for every one of us who's on this webinar to understand that we have an opportunity to create and co-create together the world that we want to have exist in the meantime, while we fight against these structures and systems that are often resistant to that. And I for one don't ever intend to cede my intention to do it, although it is sometimes exhausting, but always so worth it because of the payoff, because of the way that we can impact our world and our children by doing that work. So
Thank you. And I want to reinforce that both and, right? Because I think these cultural spaces that we can hold in our communities and we can learn from each other and celebrate and find that joy, like those are always going to be necessary and really important and impactful. And I think even if we were to realize my vision of public education, I wouldn't want those spaces to go away. You know, I think it is totally a both and I want to build on this call that I feel like, Dr. Tucker, I heard you invite people to step into their power as holders of knowledge and holders of wisdom. And that can show up in a lot of different ways. And one of the most impactful things that I had last summer, you know, when we were all on webinars and learning from each other, I got to hear Goldie Muhammad speak, who's an incredible educator, and shared one of her ideas that all administrators should see themselves as community organizers in schools. And for me, that meant all schools are sites for organizing, and all teachers are organizers, and we're all participants, and young people are organizers, right? And so I hear this like, you know, show up and make space and take space and be who you are and share your beliefs and your cultures and your values, and figure out, you know, the way that you bring that to the community. And I think it's important to recognize, I'm thinking of that social ecosystem web of how we show up in movement spaces, right? And the ways that like some of us are gonna do this amazing, some of us are gonna like promote literacy and create organizations where kids get to see Black men reading books, and some of us are gonna teach dance classes. And then some of you on this call, I'm sure, have like awesome financial knowledge that I couldn't even dream about. And actually, like maybe your work is to sit in that boardroom and demand that all of this federal funding that's going to schools right now is getting spent appropriately to support our kids of the global majority, right? And so I want everybody, like there's just not space, there's not time for us to be like, well, I don't have that knowledge, or I don't have that ability. Like there's something that you have that our kids can benefit from. And I want to challenge everybody here to really take that seriously. Take your role as an adult ally to young people seriously, and learn from other movements and learn from other organizers, and know that you know, to be an ally is a verb. To stand in solidarity means you're showing up and you're doing the work. And young people all hold at least one marginalized identity because they're young people, because they're not treated as humans, they're not treated as citizens, they're not treated as having the rights that they absolutely have and deserve internationally. And so recognize that oppression, recognize when it's being enacted, and show up in the way that you can in your power, and support them and reflect their power back to them. And so totally both and, right? Let's foster these spaces. Let's make sure we're invested in what's going on in our schools. Let's know what's going on in our schools. I mean, we have an incredible leader at the WISD. Dr. Jennifer Banks has actually been running Freedom School sessions through the county for our young people all summer, and held this youth after school youth justice coalition after school every Wednesday virtually. I mean, amazing work. So know what's going on. Know that work is happening. Partner with those movers and shakers. I mean, let's make sure that what is happening in schools and what's happening in educational spaces is also reflecting and being reflected in what's happening in our community spaces, and form these coalitions and partnerships that are, at the end of the day, going to support the young people in our communities no matter what. Like that's, if that's the vision, that's what we're always working for. And there's no space for like the infighting and the, you know, push and show up and speak and foster the spaces and take action and step up and step back when you need to and when you can. And within the schools as well, right? I mean, let's name the stuff when we see it and hold people accountable for our young people.
Thank you, Matt. Two quick things, and then I want to ask you all. There was a question of how do we get adjudicated youth a part of these programs, and my statement is kind of related. I want to acknowledge that Tamara and I, with Wakanda and Washtenaw, with Black Men Read, are very much aware. One of the reasons why we turned back to the schools and to working with community-based organizations was because of our observation that it was our kids, it was privileged kids who were showing up and at a BMR event when we were at the bookstore, right? Or, you know, at Wakanda and Washtenaw, we recognized that even though ideologically it was great, we needed to ensure that there was transportation, right? That kids from all over the community could get to this beautiful idea. And before it could be realized, the pandemic hit. So I want to just say that part of this vision has got to be that not one of our babies, not one of them gets left behind, right? So that's going to mean that you might, right this fall, like now, as we're getting ready for school, the best way you might be able to help is to give money to the Ypsi Community Schools Foundation, right? It might be that you ask your local school if they need school supplies donated, right? It might be that you check to make sure that families have access to quality childcare, which continues to be a barrier here for so many. Shameless plug, it might be that you continue to help donate books to Black Men Read, which we give away. We gave 3,000 of them away thanks to your generosity this past year, so that every kid, not just Black and brown kids, had a book that had a Black protagonist in their personal library. It might be that you give to United Way, who is invested in supporting poverty, trauma, and the downstream impacts of racism. So there is, to Matt's point, there's a way, and they're not all these audacious visions of, you know, schools that are co-working spaces. It's also the little things that matter. And so I just would urge and ask that each of you think about a way you personally can contribute to ensuring that our beloved children's histories and all of us are a part of each other's history, that they know that and that they have access to it. And a reminder, and I say this a lot, that part of the setup, y'all, of these systems of dominance are to rob us of our interconnectedness, our familial nature, our mutual aid, right? Are to make us think we're alone and powerless, to Tamara's point, and we're not. So with that, I want to pause and ask Tamara or Matt to, if you can think, if you have a response to the question about adjudicated young people. Wakanda and Washtenaw is still very conceptual, but maybe you have some other thoughts. And those of you who are with us in the comments, if you have some thoughts as well, we're opening it up for questions. I know Dr. Tucker-Ibarisha has to teach a class at 1:30, but we'll stay on for a little bit more here with questions you might have of our guest.
Can I say something real quick? I think when I'm speaking of adjudicated youth, I work for Washington WISD. I'm a social worker, okay? And what I'm saying is, what I'm speaking of, like, how can we give services to those youth? You know, when we're, like you were saying, when you have those events, a certain kids that's going to be able to come to those events. I have students who haven't been on a field trip since first grade. Okay, they're shut out of programs where you would have cultural exposure. Yeah. Where you would have the ability to have, you know, events or activities where other kids can be, you know, would have had this kind of exposure or engagement. You see what I'm saying? And we're talking about kids who are isolated and removed from their family, their peers and everything. And it's like, this is more of a push in. So I'm, you know, we're doing what we can in the juvenile detention center. You know, but I'm
Can
saying
you
this.
drop your contact information? Because what I'm hearing is really an invitation. And I know I can speak for Black Men Read. We'll show up. You know, we primarily work with younger people, but we know some brothers who would happily come in to read. And I know there are a number of people on this Zoom right now who yeah, see, they're dropping all kind of resources. So Darnisha, can you make sure that we have a way to connect with you? And what I hear you saying is, let's not forget those babies. And I appreciate that. Other thoughts? Hamida, will you drop the prompt one more time? I'd like to come back to that for the session. That might also
I wanted to also just sort of like a call. I don't know who's on the call here and like what roles people serve, but I think there's a lot of this, like the connections that we're going to make between BMR or Youth Arts Alliance or like and the ISD, right? We're really talking about like underfunded educational institutions and underfunded nonprofit institutions. And those connections, like we try to make happen. And a lot of us as educators try to reach out to these organizations, and often these organizations try to take space up in schools. And we're all underfunded and overworked. And so one, don't stop, like keep, you know, make sure what's the priority list of what schools are we going to go to. And it sounds like, you know, the juvenile facility that's served by the WISD, right? That's the top of the list. Like, let's bring the field trips to them. Let's bring the experiences to them, you know, but also, yeah, and I love ACE. Thank you for shouting that out, Laura, right? All of our like alternative schools, right? Let's make sure our kids who were pushing into these alternative spaces, right? That just aren't being served. We know that these are the primary spaces where young people aren't being served, parenting, youth, a variety of these identities. So I also want to invite, like outside of all that, you know, these businesses and these other kind of institutions that actually hold more power, more financial means. You know, I see, you know, folks like offering their employees or even requiring employees like days off to go and serve the community. But often that doesn't bring people into schools, you know, and what if, you know, what if we got creative with like making sure we're supporting our employees to do some of the things that Dr. Tucker-Ibarisha's parent was doing? You know, that like if mom actually gets paid for a day, a PTO day, to visit a classroom and bring an experience. If we have, you know, Google that like has all these, you know, I don't know, iPads that they offer their employees, and like grab them all for a day and bring them to the juvenile facility and let the kids play with them and go on a virtual field trip. Or like, how do we, you know, push back on these separations between the institutions that we have and continue to further pressure underfunded institutions to support each other, right? Let's move outside of this capitalistic shit and like re-envision how we can support each other and wrap our arms around our communities.
That's so good. That's so good. Thank you for speaking up, Darnisha. Thank you to those who are dropping, Laura and others who are dropping your organizations and contact information. And we'll snag this in the chat if you haven't been able to, and get it back to you. Thank you, Matt, for both the, you know, practical and the creative and imaginative Centering Justice offerings that you gave. Centering Justice is a space for radical imagination. And I think it's really important that thank you, Diane, that we're embracing that. Oh, yeah.
And I guess I'll just piggyback and say, you know, this year I sort of mentioned this Kwanzaa celebration that we've done, and we partnered with the Ann Arbor Cultural and Historical Museum of Washtenaw County, or sorry, no, the African American Cultural and Historical Museum. And I think we were really looking for opportunities to bring young people into that space. I think that a lot of our vision for how this has grown has been shifted by the pandemic, but even virtually, I would encourage both Sarita and the sister Darnisha, who raised up the adjudicated youth, you know, if you see this as a way that they can connect to something that's really positive and empowering for them. You know, we had young people who presented on those days, and this was done virtually, young people who brought poetry, young people who talked about history and spoke. And so I think in the virtual space in some ways presents unique opportunities for us to really transcend some of these normal silos, because we can reach people that we may otherwise not connect with. So I would say, you know, as we look toward probably that being another virtual event this year, you know, let's try to get those young people involved in that early and in really meaningful ways that are going to be opportunities for them to show leadership, to learn skills, and really get knitted into the community of people who I think can uphold and uplift and support those kids too. So I would say, you know.
And Carly, make sure you drop the Champions for Change. Y'all, we also have an opportunity. We extended our application for Champions for Change, which is our fellowship for both white leaders and leaders of color here in the community who are interested in shifting the conditions here in Washtenaw County for particularly related to race and other forms of oppression. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because one of the things that we did from the very start is a walking journey of this county's racial history. And then during COVID, we did it virtually, and we did it in partnership with the African American Cultural and History Museum. Shout out to Bev Wilkins and Deb Meadows. And we had a chance to meet elders and folks. And we're going to do that again. And I'm really delighted that our colleagues at the School of Africana Studies, led by Matthew Countryman, have just gotten a research grant for us to look at the history of segregation here. And what you need to know is that part of what we're talking about here is disrupting this perception of Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County as this liberal utopian where, you know, everybody's doing well because that's what you see in front of you. But in reality, the history, and it is deep, y'all, of segregation here is one of the reasons why so many in our community are so resource constrained. And so what the university and Countrymen and others are trying to do, and there are a number of people, there's a group working on racist covenants here and the history of that you can look at now, housing. I'm thinking about it at the News Center. I don't know if you know, but our building sits adjacent to what was a Black beach because white people in Ann Arbor, within the last 60 years, did not want to swim in the same water, a river, y'all, as Black residents. And so please, one, I don't see enough men applying and non-binary folk applying for Centering Justice, but please today share it with those communities and also continue to keep an eye on. And I think what'll happen with the U of M project is that you're going to see us scale up this journey so that more folks can participate in it. So with that, gosh, y'all see why I love Matt and Tamara? Fire. Yes. So grateful.
Well, this has been a great conversation too. I'm excited and motivated. This is one of the best ways to fight that burnout, is to know that there's a whole community of us who care about this and are willing to show up.
All right, Carly and Hamida, wrap us up, y'all.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us today. We want to know how you experienced this session. So just dropped a link in the chat to a survey to let us know how we did, what you hunger for. And as we were having this conversation, I started collecting gems from our speakers. So I just want to reflect it back as we think about emerging from this and going upon our days. What should we hold on to? We are all community stewards and learners. Remember who we are and whose we are. Proceed with relentless wonder. Do not cede your power. Step into your power. Be a punk. Go beyond surviving to thriving. Imprint upon our children and ourselves who we are. Be an adult ally to young people. We get to determine for ourselves who we get to be. We already have the ancestral wisdom in us. We can't wait, and we can and will save us. We are who we need. Thank you so much for joining us today.